Welcome, everyone, to Your Vision, Your Vote, a program of Delaware's 2020 Millennial Summit. I'm Ralph Begleiter, your host for this series of 3 election-related programs on Monday nights for the next several weeks. Thanks to the Millennial Summit organization and to Delaware's Spur Impact for hosting these programs. And thank you for firing up your computers yet again tonight to join us. Tomorrow is primary election day here in Delaware, which is why we thought these programs would be timely. Most states have by now completed their primaries, and both major political parties have all but crowned their presidential nominees. So political attention is now shifting from the states to the national election ahead on November 3rd. Tonight, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Lindsay Hoffman to our conversation. She's an award-winning associate professor of communication and political science at the University of Delaware, who teaches some of the most popular courses in the arena of media and politics. She's associate director of UD's Center for Political Communication, and she hosts the CPC's annual course and speaker series called National Agenda, which features some of the biggest and most influential names in public affairs and media. Lindsay, I don't know, do you want to say anything about National Agenda, the series starting in September, or is it too early yet to reveal your lineup?
It might be a little too early, but I do want to acknowledge that you are the creator of National Agenda. However, I think I've now officially been running it longer than you did.
That's right.
So thank you again for entrusting me with that honor. It's been one of the most rewarding experiences I've had at the University of Delaware, bringing these speakers in and engaging with my students. I can't tell you the theme of the series, which is we are the people. So it's not just we the people, it's that we are the people. We are the citizens who can make a difference in an election year. And I'm seeing, and we'll talk about tonight, a lot of enthusiasm from young people in particular about exercising their right to vote, exercising their right to protest and be engaged. So I think it's a really timely topic.
Okay, well, thanks, Lindsay. I think both of us realize that because of the virtual nature of this program, we can't really see who's out in the audience right now, but we are going to assume you are either Millennial or Gen X generations. So we're going to steer our conversation in that direction. But we're very glad to have all of those who've joined us tonight, and we hope you'll find our conversation both engaging and valuable. Now, we are trying to keep track of the chat channel on the Facebook. Do feel free to post your thoughts and questions, but just in case we get overwhelmed, I promise to try to address everything that appears in the chat. Lindsay, you alluded to this a minute ago, the combination of citizen activism and voting, the sort of two-pronged approach to influence power, and I'm sure there are others as well. But I want to ask you, do you think it's fair to say that younger people, really in any generation, not just people who are young today, but people who were once young, during the time when people are younger, do you think people are more interested in those years in activism than in voting, and that voting comes along later? Or is that a false kind of narrative to set up?
Well, first of all, I should point out that you and I were both young people at one point.
Really?
So it is kind of funny, I think, for young people to think about, and I think about people in your generation engaging in activism around the Vietnam War. And I think about people in my generation, it was very much, I was talking to my husband about this morning, because I said, do you remember how a lot of because I was in a band, everyone in the 90s was in a band, and my husband was in a band, all our friends were in bands. I said, do you remember that like a lot of the concerts that we went to were like benefits for like charities and worldwide events? And he's like, oh yeah, like more than half of them. And I thought it was kind of fascinating. Like Free Tibet was one of them. There was a lot of events around the environment. I remember participating in one that was, and you would know more about this than I would, Ralph, because I played at this concert for this benefit, but I didn't really understand the issue. It was the Zapatista movement and
Zapatista, yeah.
Zapatista movement, and I'm forgetting the Mexico city where it was. So yeah. I played a benefit for that, and I was thinking, like, I don't think that really exists right now. So you're talking about different generations, different young people. So I think young people engage differently. The way I like to think about it is that when it comes to age and political participation, there are age, period, and cohort effects. So there are some effects that are just about being young, being of a certain age, which I think you're right, that does tend to be seen as less voting, more other types of activities. In my generation, we did a lot of like boycotting and boycotting of products, purchasing or not purchasing products based on the company's environmental stances, for instance. Period effects would be something that happens because it's happened in a certain period. For example, 9/11 is something that everyone experienced. And then cohort effects are something that are sort of specific to a generation. So if we were to ask Ralph about your generation, about the most historic moment in your generation, a lot of people would say the Vietnam War or JFK being shot. People in my generation say things more like the fall of the Berlin Wall, or 9/11. 9/11 kind of goes across all those categories. So what I find interesting in talking to my students now is what are the moments that they see as sort of changing who they are. And before we left campus in the spring, they said absolutely Donald Trump's presidency is the one moment that they think has really changed their generation. And I think they see that in a way that for them, they want to enact change in opposition to President Trump. But I think that it typically, and there's a great research group called CIRCLE, it's the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. And they've been tracking young people for years. And they do demonstrate that typically younger people are less active in terms of voting, but they're really active right now, for example, in issues around, and this shouldn't be surprising, the environment, racism, and affordable healthcare. They are very engaged around those issues, and I think we've seen that in the past few months.
I guess I was trying to think back myself, and you're right. Of course, in my generation, it was Vietnam. We engaged in marches and protests, and we carried signs, just like the signs that are being. But I'm trying to think about whether people in my young generation voted, or whether they engaged in activism as a substitute or as a better thing than voting. I kind of feel like maybe some millennials and Gen Xers today feel like they want to do something. They don't want to just vote. Voting is not enough. It doesn't give them that of reward. And you won't find it surprising. I'm keying off here because to show people some of the history of voting, because it's not just a false narrative to say that young people don't vote. Young people don't vote. I mean, yes, of course, some young people do, but I'm going to embarrass you for just a second, put you on the spot. I can say that I have voted in every election since I became eligible to vote, except for one when I was traveling abroad unexpectedly and was unable to, I couldn't file in advance for an absentee ballot. Can you say that too? And I wonder whether millennials and Gen Xers today, maybe those listening to this program, watching this program, would be able to say, yes, I've voted every time since I've been eligible to vote.
Well, I was looking over your slides earlier, and you were kind of dividing the generations, and you say Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. And I kind of fall in this weird little category that is debatable as to whether it's its own thing, but it's called Exennials. So yes, like 1976 and 1983 or something like that. So I feel like I kind of border both of those categories. My brother's 6 years older than me, so he's definitely a Gen Xer. And then, of course, for the past decade or so, I've been teaching primarily millennials and now Generation Z. So yes, I have voted in every election that I could vote in. And this is as a person who came into college not being very politically active. I didn't really follow politics or understand it. But I can also say that a lot of my friends, I came of the age in the Rock the Vote, MTV Rock the Vote. So there was clearly a message to young people of my generation to say, you do need to vote. You do need to get out there. It was a huge persuasive campaign. I don't know if it was all that effective. What I can tell you about 2016 is these are millennials primarily at that point that I'm teaching. They were sophomores, juniors in 2016. And I had never seen my students more engaged in kind of the minutia around a campaign. But what surprised me, and I think what we all learned, is that they didn't vote. They were paying attention, they were engaged, they were entertained, but they didn't vote. I remember walking into my classroom the day after the election in 2016, And my students kind of all looking at me with these like wide eyes, like, what happened? And I was like, well, did you vote? And a lot of them were like, no, but I didn't think I needed to. I thought it was like a known conclusion. And this is where I think living on the East Coast or living in sort of bubbles of with people who are very similar to you can be problematic, because you don't see that there is a vast majority, like so many different opinions, so many different regions where people come from. I grew up in Kentucky, and I have seen all different sides. I've taught at The Ohio State University, which is very split between Republicans and Democrats. And I think it's important for students to familiarize themselves with other points of view, not demonize them, but understand that there are people on the other side. And that if you care passionately about these issues, that's all the more reason that you should vote.
Lindsay, let's take a look. We've been talking about the generations here. Let's bring up one of the slides, please. This is a graph that shows you the generations, and you can see I've defined the generations down here in this corner. And you may disagree with the definition, and that's fine, but that was the definition that the Pew Research people used for the purpose of gathering these data. So we're going with that. And over here are the generations. Here's the millennial generation. And the one thing that I think you can notice that reinforces what Lindsay just said about 2016, this particular chart is about midterm elections, but the presidential elections results would be essentially the same as these on a chart like this. Here's 2014, the midterm election in 2014, and it isn't until 2018 that all the generations kind of kick into gear, but especially the millennial generation kicks into gear and decides we better vote. What the heck happened in 2016? They realized, perhaps as you reported anecdotally from your students, that they didn't vote in 2016. And so in the midterm election 2 years later, they said we better get it in gear and we better vote. I would call that the Trump effect, and I'll show it on another chart as well. The 2018 midterm election is the very first time in history for millennials and Gen Xers, the very first time in history that the younger generations outvoted the boomers and older generations. Until then, as you can see, it wasn't even close. There was a huge gap between the number of people who voted in the older generations and the number of people who voted in the younger generations. So I would say that Lindsay mentioned this a minute ago, there was a Trump factor. People in the younger generations woke up and said, what happened? They came in the next day, they saw the results, and they couldn't believe their eyes and ears. And so I think we're going to find out this year in November whether millennials and Gen Xers have kept that focus during the Trump presidency for the last 3.5 years, and whether they decide we really do have to get out there and vote, or whether this chart will essentially drop back to an earlier era when maybe perhaps, and I think I'm interested in hearing your view, Lindsay, on this, are millennials and Gen Xers who in large numbers were rooting for, in the Democratic Party, for Bernie Sanders, for example. Are they going to throw up their hands and say, well, we were screwed again, we're not going to the polls? Do you have any feedback on that from your class or from other sources?
I think that's going to be true, certainly, of some Bernie supporters, but I do think that, and we haven't mentioned this yet, but being in the midst of a pandemic also changes the dynamics around this. I know you have a few questions.
Let's hold on. Yeah, hold the thought on that for just a second. So we'll come back to that right away, though.
So yeah, what you say about 2014 to 2018 is really remarkable. And University of Delaware, actually, our voting rate, we track this through a national voter registration organization at Tufts University. In 2014, our voter rate among UD students went up 27% to 41.6%, which is essentially what we see among young people in a presidential election. So that's just further evidence, even at the local level, that students at the University of Delaware were voting at much higher rates, as you mentioned. One thing I didn't say about Gen Z, I was talking about sort of millennials post 2016, that I'm seeing in them a totally new type of student in the classroom. And again, this is anecdotal, but they are incredibly engaged. They're on campaigns, they are protesting, they're marching. They really are far more involved than I think I was as a young person, and certainly more so than what I saw from millennials. I mean, let's keep in mind, when I came to UD, the Princeton Review rated us as one of the most politically apathetic campuses in the nation, which was kind of a disappointment. But it's changed, Ralph. It's changed dramatically since then. And students are eager to get into my class. I have wait lists for my classes because people want to engage in these conversations. So I do think we're going to see a difference in voting comparing millennials with Generation Z. What I'm curious about is if millennials who didn't vote in 2016 are now feeling more empowered to vote, if we're going to see a big shift in that generation in particular. We will see Gen Z voting. But again, these are a little up in the air right now in terms of how we're voting, but we'll talk about that later.
Let's take a look at another slide for just a second here. This slide shows you the generations, and the basic point of this slide is that as people age, they get more likely to vote, no matter which generation they're in. So here's the boomers in the light blue, and you can see that when the boomers were in the aged 18 to 24-year-old group, only 26% of them voted. As they aged, they became more and more likely to vote. That's also been true for Gen Xers, who, when they were 18 to 24, they were almost, I think it was 22% was the number for Gen Xers when they were in that college age group. But as they aged into their late 20s and into their 30s, they became more and more likely to vote. Now, some of them, of course, are in their mid to late 40s. And I guess there may be a few at the extreme end who are now reaching into their very early 50s. And it'll be interesting to see whether these numbers increase. This chart doesn't show it shows a few years of the millennials who, you're right, Lindsay, they have become more likely to vote as they've aged into their 30s. You can see that. So the point of this is just to say, maybe we old farts shouldn't lament so much the fact that young people don't vote, because we didn't either when we were younger. Maybe we should just expect this to change over time. And as you pointed out a second ago, the headline item would be, if millennials and Gen Xers prove us completely side, never mind history, we are going to turn out and we're going to vote. Now, I want to switch to the topic you mentioned ago, which is a new factor in voter turnout. And there isn't any data yet because we haven't had a pandemic like this before in the States. In fact, we haven't had one like this in almost 100 years, more than 100 years. So this year, you could argue that the coronavirus pandemic will have an effect on voting. We don't really know yet what effect it will have, but the very first data was gathered just 3 weeks ago when the New York Times and Siena College conducted a survey in the 6 battleground states. I've listed those at the bottom of this slide: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina. And if you're not interested in one of those 6 states, you should be saying, well, wait a minute, what about the rest of the country? You know, I'm in Delaware, why am I not on that list? Well, Lindsay and I'll talk about that in a second, but the battleground states, these 6 states are very likely to be the places where voters actually decide the November election. And so the Times and Siena College surveyed to find out whether people in those states who are registered voters, doesn't mean they're going to vote, but it's a greater likelihood that they'll vote if they've gone ahead and registered, whether registered voters would feel comfortable or uncomfortable voting in person in those battleground states in this election as a result of the coronavirus. And the chart shows you that, never mind the coronavirus, the level of comfort and voting in person depends more on whether you're a Biden supporter or whether you're a Trump supporter. As you can see in this first chart, only 6% of the Trump supporters surveyed in the battleground states say they would be too uncomfortable to vote in person in November. They're going to go to the polls no matter what. 40% of Biden's supporters say they would feel too uncomfortable to vote in the election, or would feel uncomfortable. 8% of Biden supporters say they would be too uncomfortable to vote in person. a caveat to these data is that in these 6 states, they have postal mail balloting. So people may not have to make the choice about whether to go in person or not. But it's a sense of whether the coronavirus is going to impact voting, not just in these 6 states, but elsewhere. Lindsay, I don't know if you want to comment on this before I move to the other slide. Did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I think one thing I wanted to say too about just kind of going back to sort of the age effect of being a young person. I think that when you have an age effect combining with this cohort effect or period effect, like a worldwide pandemic, I think that the stakes of the election mean something different. So when I was a young person, a lot of people that I went to college with or went to school with thought, politics doesn't affect me. It's just like, who cares? It's just a bunch of people arguing with each other. And the difference I'm seeing now is that people are saying, oh, it actually does matter who is representing you, who you vote for, who is in office, not just federal office, but House of Representatives and Senate, and even at state and local levels. People are seeing, wow, the fact that my state opened up as quickly as it did in the middle of the pandemic is a little worrisome to me. I wonder if I should think about who I'm voting for. So I think that there's something interesting there in that the virus is certainly affecting people in different ways depending on where they're getting their information. People are engaging in lots of misinformation campaigns and conspiracy theories around ways to heal the virus or to stop the virus. And that's creating an increasingly polarized atmosphere. One of the charts I don't think you have for this, but which is a great one from Pew, is just to look at how different Republicans and Democrats are from each other than just 20 years ago. Republicans and Democrats used to see some things eye to eye, and now it's like two completely unique peaks of people that just don't see across the aisle. So
actually, we can see that effect in the coronavirus as well. On this chart, you can see the blues and the reds are completely at opposite ends of the spectrum in virtually every ethnic and demographic category. There's the gap, the blue-red gap. And it's true among white people. It's true among Black people, although a little less so. It's true among Hispanics, again, a little less so than overall. It's true among age groups. 18 to 34 are widely separated. 65 and older are widely divided. And then the geographic location here, major cities, suburbs, and metropolitan, non-metropolitan areas, they threw those in because areas that were major cities where the virus had its heyday, or the first wave of the virus had its heyday about a month or so ago, a month and a half ago, it hasn't made any difference now that the suburban areas are experiencing, and the rural areas where more Republicans live are experiencing that kind of a wave of virus. It hasn't mattered to the polarization. So you're quite right. It seems to be the political polarization that is most dominant in terms of whether people decide they want to go to a poll and actually cast a vote. It's not so much about the virus.
Yeah, and it's not even just about voting. It's about just values. What Democrats and Republicans value used to overlap, and it really doesn't anymore. And that's a product of our social media environment, the competitive cable news media environment. And I fear will be exacerbated when people are in isolation from one another, because they're going to engage further and further into echo chambers or bubbles of people who agree with them. And we know from a lot of research that people will hide friends or unfollow people if they don't share their political viewpoint. And if we don't have that kind of serendipitous interaction with other people in the classroom, on campus, at a conference, at work, with someone who has a different point of view, it has, I'm afraid, very real consequences for even more increases in polarization.
Let me follow up on something you said just now and a minute ago as well. We were talking about whether this year might be different. I mean, of course, it could be different because of coronavirus. You've already mentioned that it may be different on the basis of what your students are telling you in class because Donald Trump is president and because of what happened in the 2016 election. But you also mentioned the racism issue, Black Lives Matter. do you think millennials and the students in your classes or from your research, do millennials feel that they are more woke than I was in my generation or than you were in your generation? Is wokeness going to be a factor in this year's election turnout and perhaps in the actual content of the voting itself, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know if that's the term I would use, but
I know it's an old term. It's probably 6 months old, right?
Right,
You know,
exactly.
out of date. Yeah.
I don't know what the new term is, but maybe the millennials and the Gen Zers can inform us. But I think that I'm going to do a silly thing where I'm going to use the word you use, which is woke, and compare it to a term that I used earlier, which is joke. I feel like a lot of young people for a very long time have seen elections as a joke, and I am not seeing that among these students. I have never seen them more engaged, more passionate, more interested in being informed across the board, more interested in engaging in dialogue. One of the things I do at UD is I really try to have students from different backgrounds, different Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, have conversations to be able to disagree with each other without being disagreeable, which is difficult to do right now. But I think it's essential training. And I've never seen them more and more engaged and want to engage in these conversations. I had a class assignment last fall where students could choose to be in a group project where they would go out on the green at UD and talk to strangers about any topic they wanted to talk about. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's no way my students are going to want to do this. This is a terrible idea. And more than half of my class wanted to do this project, and they absolutely loved it. They really want to engage with other people. They want to hear other people's perspectives. And so I think there is, whether it's wokeness or whether it's just a natural curiosity about other people and other people's lived experiences, there seems to be more excitement around the idea of exercising our right to vote and around being political. Like, I think in some ways being politically engaged is cool.
That's a switch. We've ticked on a number of factors. The Black Lives Matter movement that is quite recent. You know, it's a month or two old now in terms of the current incarnation of it. Of course, it's been going on for a very long time. We touched on the pandemic factor. We touched on the Trump factor. I want to ask you about one we haven't touched on, which is, do you think that millennials are thinking about the perceived dysfunction of the federal government, especially as it pertains to the coronavirus, but also I'll harken back to something that seems like a million years ago now, the inability, for example, for the Senate and the House of Representatives to pass much legislation. They were doing virtually nothing until coronavirus hit. And then all of a sudden, in the space of a week, they threw out $3 trillion worth of aid by past bipartisan assistance bills. Do Gen Xers, what can what I would characterize as the dysfunction in response to the pandemic of the feds not setting up much in the way of guidelines and devolving to the states the responsibility to actually deal with the pandemic and the hospital supplies, rules for opening beaches and opening bars and that sort of thing.
You froze up for me on a second there, so I missed the actual question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's not your fault. Sorry. This is the world we live in now.
It is the world we live in. I'll rephrase briefly. The question is, in terms of dysfunction or perceived dysfunction of the federal government, is that something you think that millennials and Gen Xers are going to be having on their minds as they approach the election this time? In other words, might they think, the federal government is dysfunctional anyway. Look at the way they screwed up the pandemic and the authority was devolved to the states. It's not about federal government anymore. Maybe it's more about states. Honestly, and so they don't need. Go ahead.
Honestly, I feel like there's a floor effect there in terms of people's trust in government. That has been plummeting for decades. And when you have I don't know what support for Senate is right now. I haven't followed that during the pandemic, but in a non-pandemic time, about 11% of Americans say they're very confident in the federal government or in Senate. So there's kind of not really much further low you can go. So I don't think that that's actually a driving issue for a lot of millennials. Like I said, it's very much about these kind of social issues that that they're seeing among their generation as being very important. The environment, before the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, and of course you mentioned this is a centuries-long fight, but before that we had Greta Thunberg and these very, very young people being very outspoken about climate change affecting their generation. And I feel, and I don't have the data on this other than from Circle, which said that those are the three most important issues to them is racism, the environment, and healthcare, affordable healthcare. I think that they're more engaged by those issues than by more structural issues around how government works or whether it's working or not. I think that, honestly, I think everyone is probably looking at how government is working right now and being like, not so sure they're handling this the best way they could. So again, I just think there's kind of a floor effect that people.
So the Supreme Court, for example, is not on the radar screen. I mean, the courts, the changes that have occurred in the last 3.5 years in the courts, the situation with the Supreme Court, where you can't get a nominee through the Supreme Court during an election year. Although who knows, hopefully.
I don't think they're thinking about that. I would say if we hadn't had pandemic, we hadn't had Black Lives Matter, the memory of Brett Kavanaugh would be very fresh in a lot of these young people's heads, because I did see their reaction to that. And I did see my students in my class who were like, oh, he's never going to make it through. He's never going to make it through this process. And I said, you guys, I wouldn't be so certain about that. And they said, but did you see him up there on the stand? And I said, yes, but. And so for that group in particular, for the students who are really engaged around that issue that year, this might be resonating with them. But I think that on the greater scheme of things, it's just those issues aren't the driving force, even as important as they are. And maybe that's should shape some of the messaging that we're sending to young people, which is this next president could dictate our laws for decades to come in terms of who they appoint to the Supreme Court. But I'm not seeing that as a major avenue of discussion among my students.
Okay, and would you say this things like what I guess you would call the structural aspects of the election itself, for example, postal mail ballots versus some other kind of voting, in-person voting or online voting or other alternatives, the election process? What about meddling from abroad in the election, which was a big deal, of course, in 2018 and in 2016? What about meddling by Americans, electronic meddling and social media meddling? Do you think those issues have sort of been swept away by what? No. By coronavirus or Black Lives Matter?
They're all relevant. We are in a very unique time period where we're kind of experiencing chaos at all levels. Culturally, politically, economically. So I think that all those issues are still really relevant. Whether we can get young people or millennials or Gen Zers to organize around any one of those things, I'm not sure, but I can say that increased pressure on corporations like Facebook and Twitter has impacted how they are handling misinformation, and even misinformation from the president himself. Twitter taking a stronger stand on this than Facebook, but Facebook feeling pressure because of them having to do so. So I think that all these things are important. I think that in 2016, we maybe thought there was something weird going on in terms of meddling, maybe from Russia or from other teenagers in Macedonia. But I think now, Americans are much more aware of how easy and how, unfortunately, how easy it is.
Pervasive.
How pervasive, exactly. So I'm hoping that at least we have the level of awareness coming into 2020 that when we see information that might look a little strange or odd, or we don't know the source, that maybe we're going to be a little bit more skeptical. I hope that we all will have a little bit more of a critical eye when we see that the Pope has endorsed a presidential candidate. Think, wait a minute, has that ever happened before? Like, is that something that the Pope really does? Or if we see someone saying, text your vote. If you want to vote for Hillary Clinton, just text this number. And I'm hoping that this generation, these 2 generations, 3 generations, are aware enough to say, I don't think you can do that yet. Like maybe we will because of this whole pandemic situation, but like I don't think we can do that yet. So I think there has to be among young people in particular, and among older people, among everyone, a higher sense of healthy skepticism about information that we're seeing, particularly information that we see that doesn't come from traditional news sources, that has been vetted, information that comes from basically we're seeing what we would have called like advocacy groups or oh my gosh.
Lobbyists.
Yeah, lobbyists. We're seeing that kind of explode, but it's exploding at a much lower level. It's not coming from top down. It's coming from individuals bottom up. And that kind of information is much harder to control or much harder to regulate. So I think that my answer is that, you know, all of these things are important. And I think that students, young people in particular, need to not only be aware of misinformation, but also be confident enough to let their parents and their grandparents know this actually isn't right. Here's the information that's correct. Because unless we start having that conversation with each other, if I just ignore my great uncle's post about you know, hydrochloroquine solving the pandemic, you know, that's a potential disservice to him and to the people that he knows. So I know it's hard. I know it puts you in a difficult situation, but I think if we can try to say like, all right, things are really heated right now, but I want to take care of my family. I want to take care of my friends. I want people not to be in danger. So for example, you know, I have in-laws who were going out to restaurants in Ohio recently. And I said, well, do you need to go out to a restaurant? You know, like, is that something necessary? Like, can you just order takeout? Like, can you maybe have a barbecue in your backyard with, you know, social distancing? Anyway, I'm just saying that these conversations, I think, need to happen. They need to happen across these polarized boundaries.
You have taken us in a good direction that I'd like to go for a while here. And that is the influence of new media, and they're not new anymore, but everybody knows what old media were. It is still the case, and I'm not sure if it will be this year because we aren't there yet, but it has been the case up to the most recent elections we've had, that television is still the place where most voters say they get most of their election-related information. They watch various things on television, including advertising, and television campaign advertising has for a very long time, for decades, been a hugely influential piece of elections, both at the federal level and at the state level. People in surveys year after year after year acknowledge that it was that little bit of doubt about this candidate or that candidate that was sown in their head by that particular ad.
Hey, Ralph, can you hear me? Ralph, can you hear me? I think we've lost your audio. Can you hear me at all? All right, hang on, folks. Technical difficulties. Can you hear me? Charlie, is it possible this is something on your end? Okay.
Microphone. 1, 2, 3,
There we
4,
go.
5. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
No worries.
All right, are we back?
Yes,
Am I
we're
back?
back. And we're back.
I apologize.
So we're about local
Sorry.
state elections.
We're talking about TV
Oh, TV.
versus social media. Have we reached the point where social media have overtaken television as the dominant source of election-related information that helps people make their decisions about elections?
Not yet,
And is that generational?
Yes.
That's the other thing.
I was going to say not yet, but that's because of older people. And what I think is kind of interesting is that a lot of this has to do with mistrust in various media. Local TV news actually still tends to be the most trusted source, particularly among older people. And my young students don't get this at all because they're like, local TV news, what?
What's that?
Right. But it's really amazing how much of a source that older people rely on that as a source. I think what becomes problematic, Ralph, is that the further we get into kind of this digital life world where everything is sort of all online, and it is that we don't know where things come from. We don't know that it was originally an ad on TV, or if it was an ad that someone created for Facebook, or if it was a campaign that was meant for, I'm just throwing things out here, Reddit, but somehow it ended up then being covered by cable TV. So there's something in the study of conspiracy theories called a sleeper effect. And that is basically that in kind of this chaotic information environment that we live in, we'll often remember reading a story, hearing a story, but we don't remember where it came from. So we will spread misinformation. We may spread conspiracy theories, even though at the time you might have looked at the source and been like, I'm not sure I trust that. But it becomes kind of mangled up with all the other pieces of information that are coming at us. So we will later on say like, oh yeah, I saw that somewhere, that hydroxychloroquine is the magic drug, when in fact there isn't a lot of evidence for that. Hey, Lauren. So yeah, I feel like it's a much more confusing media environment, and we really don't often even know what sources we're looking at. And this started back in 2004, really, when we saw the first online-only ads in terms of the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth, and how those ads ended up being replayed and replayed on cable television and on other news outlets, so that it was almost as if it was a paid television campaign. So it is even further and further mangled up now.
Now we're seeing, can you hear me? All right. And now we're seeing online ads that we're seeing campaign advertising for on some cases. They're not even buying the ads in. Delaware is an excellent example of this. You can watch television for hours in Delaware and never see a campaign ad, but they're all out there. They're online. It's because Delaware is considered a non-competitive campaign environment. If we were in Ohio or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or Florida or Arizona, the airways would be filled with campaign ads on television and online. And so I think there may be a sort of phenomenon that goes on among many people, and I suspect maybe younger people who don't, as you say, they don't watch local news, they may not even watch national news on TV. Their life is online, their world is online. The people who do spend any time on television are thinking, is there an election going on? I can't even tell it's happening. So I feel like we're maybe in a zone in between the shift of media now, where in future elections, and particularly for younger generations, we're going to see people being influenced mostly by what they see and hear online, and less by what they see and hear from what you earlier referred to as traditional media. I'd just like to raise sort of a red flag about that, which is, and it's related to something you said, people don't know what the source is of the information they're getting. And that's really sort of the role that journalists used to play, and journalists are still playing to some extent for those who are paying attention to journalists. It's journalists who are supposed to be weeding through the weeds, finding out, is this a legitimate source? Did this come from some scientific information, or some well thought out information, or some experienced information, or this thing that somebody on Twitter posted because he or she happened to think of it, and it has no basis at all in fact. And I'm worried. I am worried about whether social media are fostering an information world in which it's more difficult for people to find out what the source was, what's a it's not. And that's going to make election decisions even more difficult. It's going to just turn out to be a he says, she says situation in social media where facts play much of a role.
I think it's a little more complicated than that. I'll say a few things to that point. So one is I did a study in 2018, I believe it was, where I actually looked at generational differences between millennials and boomers, because let's face it, they're the most combative ones right now. Millennials and okay, boomer, but I wanted to compare how they perceived three types of information: satire, real news, and fake news, which is basically misinformation, completely false information. So this was an experiment. So I provided that each generation, I think had almost 1,000 participants, and I haven't published this yet. It's still in the works, but provided them with a randomly sorted piece of information. And I really thought that the millennials would be much more skeptical of information, be much more likely to spot like, oh, that's definitely fake news. And not to get too into the weeds and statistics here, but I didn't find any statistically significant differences except between millennials and boomers when it came to accurately reporting what they were reading was real news. And this kind of worries me a little bit because millennials were more likely to say that real news was fake than boomers. So boomers were more able to recognize this was a piece that came from the New York Times. They were more able to recognize that as traditional real news, whereas young people, I'm taking away from that, are just more skeptical of everything. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I've been trying to think about how do I write that up, because it's sort of opposed to what I thought would happen. But I think that we're seeing a more skeptical audience among young people. And what I'm seeing along with this enthusiasm and this kind of passion for whether it's anti-racism or the environment, climate change, is a willingness for students to really reach outside of their comfort zones and look at other news sources. I say this every year when I teach my media and politics class. I say, well, where do you go for news? And for a long time, it was just social media. I require them to read the New York Times. So now they say the New York Times. And then I say, well, where else do you go? And this year Ralph, I was frankly shocked. Somebody was like, oh, I go to 538 for polling information. Oh, I go to Al Jazeera. And I'm like, whoa. So I think there's maybe social media has been, I'm always the optimist. I think you're the pessimist and I'm the optimist. But I think that because they're being exposed to so many different types of sources, there's more of a willingness to, I would say, diversify their portfolio, explore different ideas. But at the same time, because it's so easy to get at so many of these different avenues, it's also easy to forget, like I said, where that information came from, whether it is credible. And that's, I did another study a few years back. I was telling you about this over email earlier, where citizens are starting to feel that they have to be their own journalists. And I'm sure that infuriates you, but citizens they feel like they don't know who to trust. And this is a campaign that frankly has been run by the president for years in terms of calling something fake news. And of course, that's going to erode trust in traditional news. I think what citizens don't understand is the amount of rigor that goes into traditional journalism and investigative reporting. But I do think that younger people are more open to that. So yeah, I think that we're experiencing some pretty strong generational differences. And I don't know if it's because I'm kind of in the middle that I'm like, okay, guys, like, settle down. You're more similar than you are different. Like, you can get along.
Well, I don't think it's really a matter of whether they get along or not. They don't have to get along. They just have to be able to make sound public policy decisions. And those decisions are related to not just who do you vote for, although of course that's an important factor, but it's all kinds of public policy issues. Are you going to write to your senator or to your congressperson or to your governor or to a mayor or anybody or town council about some kind of public policy on the basis of information that you have been told by authoritative figures that you have been brought up to respect, that those sources are fake? And so then do you draw back and you say, well, I can't trust anything, so I guess I can't get involved in this public policy? I think that would be a terrible result if people had so many sources that they couldn't figure out which ones were real and which ones weren't, and then decided, you know what, I'm going to throw up my hands and focus on the things I can focus on, because everybody's time is limited. I mean, you know about me, you know this fact, I'm not a sports fan. And so I just screen out anything that has to do with sports. And I might glance over it. And yeah, if somebody asked me, you know, what city do the Cardinals play in, you know, maybe I could possibly come up with the right city, but it just doesn't matter to me. So I screen it out. What I worry about is that important things will get screened out by people who say, I can't figure this out. I don't know how many players there are on the team. I don't care how many players there are in the Senate. I don't care, you know, about the data on climate change. I don't care about whether the Russians are meddling in our elections or not. Elections are all just blues and anyway, and it's all polarized. I'm worried about people throwing up their hands, and because it's so difficult
right.
to figure
it is
all out.
But I think that, you know, in some ways the pandemic shines a spotlight on how important politics is. So I was going to tell you, typically I could share my screen. I don't think I can share it on here, but I had my screen up from my day one of politics and media. So this is often the first class that students have taken around politics and media. And I have this slide where there's a college student laying on the green and there's a thought bubble above her head that says, meh, politics. What does it matter to me? Like, I used to have to explain to students how politics affects them. I'm like, roads, parks, civil liberties. Like, I had to explain that. And Ralph, I don't have to explain that anymore. We hit the ball running, or whatever the analogy is. So I do feel that there are a lot of younger people who are seeing it as something that's just essential to understand. One of my speakers from a couple of years ago is Gabe Fleischer, and he's now heading off to college in the fall, but he started a political newsletter when he was 11 years old. And last I checked, it has over 50,000 followers, including many well-respected journalists and politicians. I have a friend who just posted on Facebook today, her son, I think who's also 11, created a YouTube video about his predictions about the 2020 election. So I feel that in some ways, unlike millennials who kind of could forget about politics in the Obama years, there wasn't a lot of turmoil. Young people today can't forget about it. It's part of the dialogue. It's part of who we are. So I think that they're much more willing to step into it. You know, as Gen Xers they were called the slacker generation. Like, they really didn't care. They were kind of what you're describing, like, there's just too much. I've got other things I want to focus on. I'm in a band. You know, I don't want to worry about politics. But one thing I really want to say here before I think hopefully we can get some questions or wrap up is I'm working with a team of engineers right now. I've been working with them for a number of years. I think you know this. To create technology that discourages people from staying within their own echo chambers and actually alerts them, like sends a little alert like, hey, you've been paying a lot of attention to sources that are really far left or really far right. And here's where people actually fall on this issue if you look at public opinion data. And I can tell you I'm working on a proposal for that right now. And I've never seen my engineering colleagues more excited. Like, I feel like engineers and people who are creating these technologies are thinking more about the social ramifications and the political ramifications of their choices, rather than a Twitter or a Facebook that created the technology and then was like, okay, let's just see what happens and we'll respond if something goes wrong. So I think, again, I'm being a little more optimistic. I think that social scientists and engineers are beginning to work together to be more intentional in creating technologies, creating plugins, apps, whatever it is, that will alert people to their own biases and kind of help self-correct that. And when I first proposed that idea to an organization, I think it was 2014, they were like, okay, that's a great idea, but who wants that? Who wants to do that? And Ralph, I think you can, essentially say a lot of people are now like, yeah, please help me. I don't know how to sort through all this stuff. Please tell me what I'm looking at and help me figure this out. So in just a matter of 6 years, you know, that has changed dramatically. So I think that this is a real period of change. And I honestly feel that there's a positive impact of the pandemic on sort of alerting people to like, wow, the government actually really does play an important role in my life. It plays a role in where I can go, what I can wear outside, how I can communicate with other people. So in some ways, I just think it just put in sort of sharp relief is what I'm looking for. Like, oh, yeah, politics is actually really, really relevant. And as far as a period effect or a cohort effect rather among this generation, if you think about that, they are being, like my 9-year-old daughter right now is very engaged in what's happening politically, and we talk about it a lot. I never talked about politics with my parents when I was 9. So we're raising a generation, and she's technically in Gen Z, I think, at this point, who have that kind of embedded into their understanding of who we are as Americans, if we're speaking specifically about Americans, that this is just what you do. This is, you go out and vote because that's what you're supposed to do. So I'm enthusiastic and feeling optimistic about this generation in particular. They've been a joy to teach, that I don't have to explain to them, you should vote because, and they're like, well, yeah, of course I vote. Of course I voted. Yeah, of course I sent my ballot in. Whereas just a few years ago, asking them to register for an absentee ballot felt like, pulling teeth. So I'm optimistic.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I'm not pessimistic about it. I'm worried about the multitude of sources, and I'm worried about all the distractions we have with other things that tug on our lives. I can testify that when I was 9, I had political discussions with my parents as well.
I'm not surprised.
Which is why I grew up to be the way I am. We are approaching the end of the program now, and I'm looking at the chat room. There's a few people in there who have commented on things. If any of you have a question that you'd like to Lindsay, by all means, now's the moment to say it. But we'll be wrapping up momentarily. That as a kind of closing theme, if you will, Lindsay, I think you're right that the pandemic may be something that brings to people's minds the role of government at every level, not just at the federal level, but at the very local level as well. I can tell you here in Delaware, of course, it's the smallest town councils in Dewey Beach and Rehoboth Beach and Bethany Beach who have been making essentially momentous decisions, not just for Delawareans, because Marylanders and Washingtonians, Jerseyans who all want to come to the beach in Delaware are being affected by decisions being made by 7 council people who they didn't vote for, and hadn't voted for them in those little towns. We have Jennifer who would like to know how to. Oh, there it is on the screen. How in wanting to learn more about politics? Well, you're the right person to answer that question.
That's true. Well, because of what I do, my daughter hears me talking about politics all the time. And in fact, when I was talking about, she goes to this really kind of socially progressive school where they talk about issues together. They don't shy away from politics. I was describing the National Agenda program to someone, and she goes, "Oh, that's basically like my school for college kids." And I was like, "Yeah, it is." And so she's already being raised in a school environment that encourages differences of ideas, that encourages individuality, that doesn't say this isn't okay to talk about. So, and I'm going to relate this to race too. And I know we're running out of time, but the other thing, when it comes back to this, talking to your kids about race, I think is really important right now too. One of the things that I talk to my students about is for white folks, oftentimes the very first experience, if they've grown up in a primarily white area, the first time they might ask their parents, they see a person of color, they say, "Why is that person brown?" or "Why is that person black?" And if any of you out there are white parents or white people who've grown up primarily white areas, you probably know that one of the first things that a mom might say is, "Shh." And when you see that shh, that indicates this is a bad thing to talk about. We don't talk about it. There's something bad associated with being that color. So I feel like it's really just about engaging in thoughtful conversations. Like, why do you think that is? Or what do you think about what the president said? But not being hyper partisan in either direction, and just demonstrating that there are lots of different perspectives and lots of different ways of thinking about things. There are a lot of great videos and books out there that I could probably cull some resources together if anybody would like.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lindsay Hoffman, an associate in communication and political science at the University Delaware. She teaches media and politics and a program called National Agenda, about which you'll hear more later this summer. And I urge you, if you're in this audience, to pay attention to that. Watch for that headline to come out from the University of Delaware, because you'll be interested in those programs. Lindsay also is the Associate Director of UD's Center for Political Communication. Next week at the same time, 7:30 p.m., same time, same station, as they used to say, we'll meet Domenico Montanaro, who is the National Public Radio Senior Political Editor. He's someone who keeps track of the pulse. He's got his finger on the pulse of national politics all the time. And next week, we'll be talking about the national battleground scene for the November 3rd, 2020 election. Thank you all for joining Your Vision, Your Vote, 2020 Millennial Summit. Begleiter, good evening, everyone.